Right. Well, I'm Malcolm Holmes, the chair of the Camden History Society in London. We hope to start this fascinating international event. We do have the mayor of Camden, Councillor Nazma Rahman, hoping to join us. She is running, I think, a little bit late, but I hope she'll be able to join us later on. But can I hand you over now to David Hayes of the Camden History Society in London, who will talk about how the name Camden spread throughout the world. He's carried out an incredible amount of research and has been in touch with Camdens everywhere for information, which has been generously offered in many cases. So David, over to you.
Good morning and good evening, wherever you are. The purpose of this event is twofold. First, to mark the 400th anniversary next Thursday of the Elizabethan scholar William Camden, and secondly, to launch a new online resource charting how William's surname has been preserved in some 50 place names across the globe, from Alaska to Chile and New Zealand. Last year, I contacted all the local historical societies I could find in places in or covering places called Camden, inviting them to contribute short histories of their own communities. From most of them, there was an enthusiastic response, for which I'm extremely grateful. Their contributions are acknowledged on future slides. Places without a responding society, I had to research myself, using whatever online sources I could find. The end product is the resource that we're launching tonight. There will be 3 talks. I will introduce you to the 3 men behind all this, and then take you on a rapid world tour of some of the places with Camden names. Then Angela Hatton will talk to you about William Camden, and Joan Inabinet will speak to us from South Carolina about her city. William Camden was a man of many parts, serving at various times as a schoolmaster, librarian, and royally appointed herald. But he's most remembered for his Britannia, a county-by-county survey of the British Isles, which he wrote in Latin and was later translated. William moved out of London to Chislehurst in later life, where he died. Nearly a century later, after William's death, his Chislehurst house was demolished and replaced by a building named Camden House in his memory. Then in 1760, the property was sold, renamed as Camden Place, and gradually remodeled into the Georgian mansion that we know today. The new owner of the house was this man, lawyer and Whig politician Charles Pratt. First a barrister, then a judge, then... Oh, dear. First a barrister, then a judge, then a chief justice, and eventually he entered government as Lord Chancellor. And then in 1765, on becoming a lord, he chose as his title Baron Camden of Camden Place Chislehurst. And so the childless William Camden's surname passed as a title of nobility to a quite unrelated family. Pratt would later become Earl Camden. As Chief Justice, he'd acquitted John Wilkes, a radical member of Parliament, accused of libelling King George III. As a result, he was regarded as a champion of civil rights and was almost idolized in radical circles and more widely. In Parliament, he was a staunch defender of the rights of the American colonists. While not favouring independence, he strongly condemned the taxation of settlers without representation and threats of military action against those who rebelled. Although he never visited America, he thus became very popular there by reputation. The third man is Earl Camden's son and heir, John Jeffreys Pratt, who followed his father into politics. For 3 years, he was Lord Lieutenant of Ireland at a time of great unrest, and a coastal fortress there was named after him. He later served as Secretary of State for War and the Colonies. In 1812, he became the first Marquis Camden. To avoid confusion, I'm going to refer to him as the second Lord Camden and his father as the first. So much for the three men. Now for the promised rapid world tour starting in England. Soon after his acquittal of John Wilkes, the idolised Lord Camden was honoured in the naming of several London streets and public houses. These included the Camden Head pub in Islington, still trading today, what is now Camden Walk, and narrow Camden Passage, seen here, nowadays a magnet for lovers of antiques. Camden Bath is a desirable neighbourhood in the West Country city. One of the first Lord Camden's various positions was as recorder or presiding judge for the city of Bath, and his son, the second Lord, served as the city's Member of Parliament. Built in 1787 to 88, up a steep slope, though not wholly completed because of landslips, was magnificent Camden Crescent. Its pediment bears Lord Camden's coat of arms, and the doorways are adorned with elephants' heads, the Pratt family's heraldic emblem. Our own Camden Town in North London was begun on land actually owned by the Lords Camden. Through his marriage to Elizabeth Jeffreys in 1749, the first Lord eventually inherited the leasehold of a tract of farmland then just north of London. In 1789, he obtained an Act of Parliament allowing him to lease land for building houses. At first comprising just a few streets, the new suburb quickly became known as Camden Town, and that name gradually became applied to an area much wider than Lord Camden's estate. With a partly industrial past, including piano making and gin distilling, the district is known today for its Royal Veterinary College, founded as early as 1791, its media companies, its long-standing vibrant rock music scene, and the hordes of tourists flocking in Camden to Camden Lock on the Regent's Canal and the nearby sprawling Camden Market. The world's last named Camden, and the most populous urban one, is the London Borough of Camden, formed in 1965 by a merger of three smaller boroughs of Hampstead, St Pancras and Holborn. The name Camden was chosen because of Camden Town's central position in the new borough. Physically, socially and ethnically diverse, Camden stretches between the leafy northern heights with the large open space of Hampstead Heath, southward into through mainly residential areas into such central London districts as Bloomsbury and Fitzrovia. Here are a few major landmarks. The borough contains a so-called knowledge quarter with such national institutions as the British Museum and the British Library, major parts of London University, 3 teaching hospitals, as well as 2 ancient inns of court and 3 major railway stations. It's time now to cross the Atlantic to North America. The first Lord Camden's sympathy with the grievances of the colonists led to many places there being named after him, places of all shapes and sizes. The first town in the world to be so named in 1768 was Camden, South Carolina, previously known as Pine Tree Hill, with a battle to its name, and today dubbed the steeplechase capital of the world. Joan will tell us more about this later. The world's most populous Camden is Camden, New Jersey, with 500,000 inhabitants. Camden County, New Jersey, with 500,000 inhabitants. The post-industrial city of Camden lies on the Delaware River opposite Philadelphia, separated from it by the Benjamin Franklin Bridge. Past industries have ranged from shipbuilding to the making of Campbell's soup. The city's site was first settled in the late 17th century by English and Irish Quakers, among them William Cooper, a London blacksmith. His great-great-grandson, Daniel, laid out the first town streets, and what was originally called Cooper's Ferry became known as Camden after the first lord. Today, Camden City's population is overwhelmingly African American or Hispanic. Notorious in 1971 for racial unrest and riots, the city is now, which is home to Rutgers University, is now revitalizing itself with a focus on medicine and education. Camden County, North Carolina was created in 1777 and named for the first Lord Camden. It lies at one end of the Great Dismal Swamp Canal, once a busy commercial waterway, but now given over to pleasure craft. The town of Camden lies on the eastern banks of the Pasquotank River across from Elizabeth City. With a population of just 620, it boasts 5 schools and 2 notable historic buildings, including the preserved Camden County Jail. Camden, Maine is on the Atlantic coast beside the Megantic River. Incorporated in 1791, the town was named after a pre-existing Camden plantation, misspelt with a B. Once a summer residence for wealthy northeasterners, it's now a retirement community, resort and sailing venue whose population triples in the summer. Each year, the town hosts renowned international film and Shakespeare festivals and the Camden Conference on Global Issues. The town of Camden in upstate New York was established as a political unit in 1798, when it was formed out of the town of Mexico. Industry began with several sawmills along local rivers, and later wood-connected industries included the making of furniture and pencils. Contained within the town of Camden is the village of Camden, incorporated in 1834, and also known as the Queen Village. Camden in Indiana was begun around 1830 and at first nicknamed Stringtown because at that time it only had one street. It was officially named Camden by the town's first postmaster. Camden has remained small and with a population of about 600 is still, we're told, a quiet place to live where people know and care for one another. Dating from at least 1837, Camden, Michigan was at first known as Cranbrook, but changed its name to Camden in 1840. The new name was chosen at random by drawing names out of a hat and was proposed by sawmill owner Easton Chester, who hailed from Camden, New York. Camden originally lay on the St. Joseph River, but by 1872 its citizens had literally upped sticks and moved the entire village up onto a neighbouring hillside. Camden, Alabama lies in the Alabama Black Belt in Wilcox County, founded in 1819. By 1832, land had been donated to form a new county seat, at first called Wilcox Courthouse. The little town quickly grew, and one of the incomers was physician and politician John Daniel Caldwell, a cousin of John Caldwell Calhoun, U.S. Vice President and South Carolina Senator. In 1841, Caldwell proposed renaming the town, the Alabama town, Camden, South Carolina. Its notable sons and daughters have included an interpreter at the 1919 Versailles Peace Conference. Camden County, Missouri, was formed in 1841 and at first called Kinderhook County, but after 2 years was renamed after the first Lord Camden. In 1929, work began on a vast reservoir, 92 miles long, created by damming the Osage River and known as the Lake of the Ozarks. Among the several towns and villages that were permanently flooded by the new reservoir was the existing county seat of Lynn Creek. Obviously, a replacement on dry ground was needed, and in 1831, work began on a new city to be called Camdenton. In Alaska, 2 large bodies of water were named by British naval officers and Arctic explorers. One by Captain George Vancouver after the first Lord Camden, and another much later by the ill-fated Captain John Franklin after the second Lord. With 24 other US Camdens left unmentioned, including 2 ghost towns, we move on now to Canada. One of its 3 Camdens is the historic Camden Township near Dresden, Ontario. Founded there in 1794 was the Dawn Settlement, intended as a self-sufficient community for former slaves. Dresden was one of the termini of the so-called Underground Railroad, the network of safe houses and clandestine paths that were used by enslaved people escaping north from the south. The settlement's co-founder was the Reverend Josiah Henson, himself an escaped slave turned Baptist minister. His autobiography is thought to have inspired Harriet Beecher Stowe's 1852 anti-slavery novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And so Henson has been known by many as the original Uncle Tom. His restored Dawn Settlement house it has been preserved and is now part of an open-air museum. Offshore now and southward to Bermuda, where the parish of Paget has a neighbourhood called Camden. This house of that name, dating originally from about 1714, but much altered since, is the official residence of the Prime Minister of Bermuda, although in practice no Premier has ever actually lived there. In the Caribbean, Trinidad's Camden base is now a heliport, but was previously a wartime US military base. It owes its name to a sugar plantation owned in 1812 by a certain William Lushington, a member of Parliament for the City of London, whose address was given as Camden Place Chislehurst. So a surprising close connection there. Way down south now to Tierra del Fuego, the archipelago partly in Chile at the southern tip of South America. On its Pacific coast are the Camden Islands, their name now Hispanicized by the Chilean authorities. The main island, London Island, is bounded on one side by a body of water called the Brecknock Passage. Earl of Brecknock was a subsidiary title of the second Lord Camden. On another side of the island is the Pratt Passage. Moored there for 3 weeks in 1830 was HMS Beagle, on its first voyage and without Darwin at that stage. Its captain, Robert Fitzroy, named various features in the region after his Fitzroy relations, such as Grafton Island and Euston Bay. But he was also, on his mother's side, a great nephew of the second Lord Camden. Although there are Camdens in 6 continents, there are slim pickings in Asia and Africa. Asia can offer only an upmarket post-war housing development in Singapore, and Africa only this coal-powered power station in South Africa, recently recommissioned to cope with an energy crisis. So swiftly onward to Australia. Early explorers named a sea bay and a harbour there after the second Lord Camden, who of course was for a time colonial secretary. The town of Camden, New South Wales also bears his name, but for a particular reason. While he was colonial secretary, Lord Camden was lobbied by John MacArthur, an Australian settler in London facing charges of duelling. MacArthur was granted 5,000 acres of land in New South Wales called cow pastures for the purpose of sheep farming. Regarded in an overblown way as the pioneer of the merino wool industry, MacArthur renamed the cow pasture property Camden Park in gratitude to the second Lord Camden. Developed on part of it from 1840 was the historic town of and Sydney suburb that Camden is today. Finally, to the South Island of New Zealand, and a remote sheep station called Camden, with its own airstrip and offering bed and breakfast accommodation to passing tourists. For reasons unknown, this homestead was so named by a certain Philip McRae in 1852, a sheep farmer of Scottish extraction. Just a few miles away is Mount Camden, which at 4,500 feet high must surely be the world's highest Camden. And on that high note, we end our tour. I've only been able to talk about a fraction of the Camdens Worldwide. They all feature in the online compilation with a great deal more information about so many of them. And for good measure, the compilation also includes details about the Learned Camden Society, named after William Camden, various sailing ships named after the first Lord Camden, and the spread of the Pratt family's Elephant's Head heraldry. The compilation takes the form of a set of interactive web pages designed by Lindsay Douglas, also our host this evening. There are links to websites of contributing societies and to many others, and even a few videos. There's also the option of an alternative version in the form of a downloadable PDF, which can be printed out. To access either version, visit the Research Room page of the Camden History Society website. And at that point, I will hand you over to Angela Hatton, tour guide at Camden Place Chislehurst, where the chain of Camden Place namings first began.
Thank you very much, David. For that whistle-stop tour around the global Camden network. And more importantly, can I personally thank you for the Herculean effort that you've put in to pulling this together. I think I triggered it because I was trying to make contact with 2 Camden golf societies, and we failed even to do that very effectively. So 100 million thanks to you for what you've achieved. And I'd like to add my warm welcome to everyone that's logged in to this session from Chislehurst, where we are, as David said, in the process of preparing to celebrate or remember, I suppose, celebrate the life of William Camden next Thursday on the 400th anniversary of his death. And my role this evening is to share with you just a few of the remarkable achievements of this man, William Camden. And at least I would if I was able to make my screen move, which isn't that helpful, is it? Okay, just excuse me one moment. I'm not quite sure why I'm not moving my screen. I think I may just need to go back. There we go. I guess the thing to start with is why this man, Camden, sort of is counted as so remarkable. He is, as David's already said, involved in all sorts of things. He was an antiquarian, a herald, a teacher, a writer, and a poet. And I think it's fair to say the most celebrated scholar of Elizabethan England, and that's quite something when you think his contemporaries included William Shakespeare, for example. He would have been considered to be a chronicler. He was a witness to the Reformation. He lived throughout Queen Elizabeth's reign, born during Queen Mary's, but lived through Elizabeth and most of James I. He died 2 years before James I died. So very much a participant in one of the most interesting periods of history of the country. He would have described himself, I think, not as a specialist, but as a generalist. But in each of those fields, he wasn't an amateur. He made significant contributions across almost everything he did. He would have been one of those people it was annoying to know. He was great at everything. And I don't think it's too far a stretch to say that we can claim that he was the grandfather of modern history. But my thought about him, the thing that matters, that makes the biggest difference as far as I'm concerned in terms of why he's so remarkable, is that this was a self-made man. Everything that we know about him started from a really, really poor beginning. He was born essentially, if not complete poverty, but certainly in a very, very poor area of London. His family, his father was a craftsman. He was painter and stainer who moved from Shropshire to London to better the family. But it was still a very poor, if improving, financial situation. He was born in part of London called Old Bailey. And he was successful at a time where class patronage were the keys to success. And this man, from those very humble beginnings, ends up winning the respect of scholars across multiple disciplines, and also, importantly, manages to keep in favour with both his queen and his king. And he's still talked about 400 years on. So the fact we are talking about him, I think, is quite significant. I think there are a couple of points of luck, aren't there, in anyone's a story? And William Camden's actually started when he was 7, an age when he was potentially going to start school. And Christchurch Hospital, a Bluecoat school for orphans and the poor, was just opening. And he was one of the very first children to go and be educated at the Bluecoat school, where the focus was very much on educating their students for life, so to give them the skills they needed to do well. And so he obviously got some really good basic education there. And then tragically, at the age of 12, he gets the bubonic plague, which could have obviously ended his life very, very early. He recovers, and luckily again recovers with no blemish, which was probably quite important to, you know, his position generally, and some of the other things he did. And he wins a scholarship place because of his singing. He is on the chorister's course at St. Paul's Cathedral School. Now, this is a very, very different school experience. This is in a wealthy area, middle-class children, contacts that would continue to help him with patronage throughout his career. And he does extremely well in that school. And at age 15, he goes up to Magdalen College, again as a chorister. His singing is obviously quite important in establishing his position in those early days. However, at the end of the first year, his role or his place in the college isn't continued, and he moves to Christchurch, which is where he first starts to be interested in antiquity. At the end of 4 years at Oxford, he petitions for his bachelor's degree. No exams in those days, you petitioned for your degree, and it is refused. Now, it's hard to believe it was refused because he wasn't intellectually capable. It is more likely to have been infighting in the college, or possibly just discrimination against a young man who was quite as came from such a, you know, a humble background, an unusual position. However, after 3 years, and we don't really know what he did in those 3 years, the only thing we're pretty clear about is he had to work somewhere. He would have needed the income. And so he was busy doing something. But in 1574, he petitions again for his degree, and this time it is awarded to him, which allows him to take on the post as second master at Westminster School. Westminster School is a really important school. The foundress is considered still to be Queen Elizabeth, although Henry VIII was the one who saved the school after the dissolution of the monasteries. Elizabeth herself visited the school at least once a year to attend the Latin play. And it's hard to believe that over 18 years as second master, that William Camden didn't meet her. And this is likely to be where his first contact with her happened. He's a very popular and very successful teacher. And in 1593, he becomes headmaster, a role he only keeps for 4 years. But again, it's just worth taking a moment to think about the fact that this man, who was born into poverty in central London, actually becomes the headmaster of one of the most influential schools in London. That alone would be a fairly remarkable achievement, I think. He makes lots of improvements at the school and is considered still to have been a leading educationalist. And just as part of his, sort of spare time, he writes a Greek grammar book. And that Greek grammar actually became the standard grammar textbook for English schools for over 100 years. So quite a bestseller. And just in case he didn't have enough to do whilst he was headmaster or teaching at the school, both, he took on the role of librarian of Westminster Abbey. And during the 1590s, genealogy becomes a growing interest of his. And so he writes a guidebook to the tombs of Westminster with their heraldic coats of arms explained to people. It's only 41 pages, but it became an exemplar and followed widely by churches and cathedrals all around the country. And again, is a piece of work that people describe now as having been extremely important and innovative in the world of the churches. So you can see his work as a writer is starting, but he did lots and lots of other stuff. He produced an alphabetical list of proverbs. He wrote about the gunpowder plot, lots and lots of Latin poetry, booked across this wide range of subjects. And you've already had mentioned by David his Britannia work, which is the one that everyone remembers him for. His second most important work, The History of Queen Elizabeth's Reign. I've come across recently, and in fact actually had delivered today, an 1860 edition of his book called Remains. Remains was the only book he wrote in English. Everything else was in Latin. And it was the remains from his research on Britannia. And it was set out as a set of little history stories in English for a wider market, including me, because my Latin's not very good, I'm afraid. Britannia was a really important work. It became his life's work. He added to it throughout his life. It was a bit of a tapestry. You could almost describe it as his lifetime hobby. He started the work when he was teaching at Westminster, and the holidays gave him chance to go and do primary research, looking at original artifacts, traveling to different towns, and researching original documents. This was a man who was incredibly diligent, not just hardworking. Britannia's fundamentally a story about how the Romans were in Britain, the story of Roman Britain. So he took himself to Italy, to Rome, to learn Italian so that he could look at sources in their original. And because he needed to include Wales in his Britannia, he also went to Wales and learned Welsh. So he was no slouch academically. Britannia becomes a real cultural icon, and it is in 4 editions within 5 years, including an edition published in France and one in Germany. One of the benefits of writing in Latin was people on the continent could read it as easily as people, educated people in Britain. His second book, he didn't love quite so much. The Annals of Queen Elizabeth was undertaken at the request of his patron, Lord Burleigh, and he was really, really unwilling to do it. He was very resistant, and possibly not without cause. One of his contemporaries, John Hayward, had written a book about Henry IV, which had offended Queen Elizabeth. She accused him of sedition and had him thrown in the Tower, where he stayed until she died. So you can imagine that poor William Camden's now been asked to actually write a story about the reign of Queen Elizabeth. It must have been like walking on eggshells to try and make sure that one was not offending in any way. He actually abandons the writing in 1598. But in 1608, while he is now living in Chislehurst, James I commands him to restart it. And so the 4th book is written from his home in Chislehurst. You can still see his reluctance about this. He doesn't want the annals published until after his death, although actually the first 3 books are published in 1615. And there are, he also insisted it was only ever published in Latin. And altogether, there are 10 versions of the annals as he changes the tone and style, if you like, of the work to meet the sensitivities of his patrons. And Camden is still making headlines. I don't know if some of you saw only a few months ago, the British Library, who were digitizing one of the original copies, have actually found evidence of the papers overlaying sections of the book where he is rewritten to meet those needs of sensitivities, as it were. His phrasing throughout is very careful, and he uses a lot of classical illustrations to make the points without being perhaps too obvious. But I think when you consider the times and the censorship and the speed with which retribution could land on his head, it's quite remarkable that he was able to write about Elizabeth's reign without actually getting into trouble. His other amazing success, and this again is where you see him go from being a poor boy in central London to probably one of the most powerful roles in society in England, was he was made King of Arms, the Clarenceau King of Arms, which is one of the top 3 positions in the College of Heralds. If any of you watch the proclamation for King Charles on the steps of the Royal Exchange, the herald who did the proclamation was the Clarenceau King of Arms. That was the role that Camden would have held. And in this image, you can see him in the centre, presiding at Queen Elizabeth's funeral. The heralds were really important. They were responsible for issuing and policing arms. And the income that came from those positions meant that he could retire from his role in Westminster School, although he supported the school financially throughout his life. And I picked this up only 48 hours ago, attending an online lecture about Elizabethan England. And this picture was actually attributed to Camden himself as an artist. He illustrated lots of stuff in the Britannia, and he obviously could draw. And so just amongst other things, he's busy making beautiful paintings. His diplomacy is applauded by, in fact, painters and stainers, probably recognizing his capability there. His father was a painter stainer, and he was also a member of the painter stainers. When he becomes Clarenceau King of Arms, there is a long-running battle going on between the College of Heralds and the painters about who can paint the heraldic symbols. Camden manages to find a very clever solution, which ensures that 8 painter stainers are employed by the college, and they still thank him to this day. It's the 5th oldest guild in England, and Camden's picture, the one on the right, stands above in the hallway above the stairs. David's already told you that in the end he moves to Chislehurst, small village outside central London. But a lot of people were looking for places that had better air pollution and were a bit safer from the outbreaks of plague. And Chislehurst was fantastically positioned, very close to the royal household at Greenwich, and of course, only 10 miles into the city. And William Camden first came here because his lifelong friend and fellow chorister from Westminster, William Heather, and his wife nursed him back to health from another bout of illness. Camden obviously liked the area and his friends there, and he either built or bought a house. We're really not sure. We know it wasn't on the footprint of the current Camden Place, but it was in the grounds, as it were. It was the start of the Camden estate, surrounded on 3 sides by the common. And one of the local Bromley architects, a guy called Ken Wilson, depicted his house in this drawing. Personally, I think Camden's house would have been a little simpler than this, a little more humble, because he had no wife, he had no children. He did have a big library, which was very important to him. And in fact, as his health deteriorates, a number of people tried to lay claim to part of his library. But in the end, he left it to one of his students, Robert Cotton, and it becomes part of the Cotton Library, which was then founded. He had money. In those days, the average gentleman in Kent died leaving £167. He left a lot more than that, because the manor of Bexley, which he first leaves the income to his friend Heather and then to Oxford University, was worth £400 a year on its own. And of course, he had the house in Chislehurst and various other things. And so the income from the manor at Bexley goes to found the endowed lectureship in history at Oxford. It was the first in the world, and it continues to this day. So today it's the oldest chair of history in the world, the Camden Professorship of Ancient History. And since 1910, quite appropriately, it has been limited to focusing on Roman history. So Camden he's very poorly. He's been ill on and off for a long time, but his health really deteriorates. He ends up paralyzed. He was very well prepared for his death. He organized everything himself, and he was very clear that he wanted to be buried where God decided it was right to take him from this world, which would have meant he should be buried in Chislehurst. But his friends decided that he was much too important to be buried in a small village in Kent, and instead he's buried in the south transit of Westminster Abbey. And on the right, you can see his beautiful tomb with an image of the man holding Britannia and his own heraldic shield on the right, and the one for the heralds on the left. There was a lot of pageantry associated with the funeral, which in those days tended to reflect the social class system. So 26 poor men in gowns, gentlemen in cloak, esquires, knights, and finally his executor, Dr. Heather. All the mourners were old-time friends and students. So 400 years on, this man is still remembered. I think he lived by his personal motto, which, just to impress you, was ponder non numero. That's not my Latin being very good, but basically means weight is more important than numbers. In other words, quality rather than quantity. And I think that it's fair to say that he lived by that. David's already told you how well his name has lived on in terms of his own works through the Camden Chair of History and Camden Societies and so on. And in fact, Britannia itself remained very important. And it's interesting that on the 400th anniversary of its publication, it was described as still fundamentally colouring the way in which historians look at our country. And if you want to believe you've become famous 400 years after your death, you can even buy a jigsaw puzzle of him from Puzzle You if you'd really like to. And so he was important enough. His reputation was still so significant that 100 years after his death, when Robert Weston buys his house and knocks it down to start a new country property, he names it Camden House, as David told you. And from there, in a way, the rest is history. Charles Pratt renames it Camden Place, and so it's become the root source of all those other Camdens that we've been hearing about from David. And it's been the home of Chislehurst Golf Club for 130 years, a beautiful, challenging, short parkland course. So if anyone you want to come and have a visit, you'll be very welcome. And I want to leave you with one question. It's a question I would love to be able to answer for you. This is a picture of the entrance hall in Camden Place. It's oak Jacobean, carved by Flemish carpenters in the early 1600s, at exactly the same time as William Camden was building his house here in Chislehurst. It is possible that this panelling was once in Camden's property and was salvaged by Weston when he started his new home, and then moved again to create what was the servants' entrance to Lord Camden's house. And until someone can tell me it didn't come from William Camden's house, I like to think of him sat agonizing over the last book of the Annals of Queen Elizabeth and hoping he doesn't end up his life in the Tower. Thank you very much. And I'm going to now hand the baton over to Joan Inabinet Kershaw County Historical Society. Thank you, Joan.
Thank you. Thank you. It is a pleasure to introduce you to friendly and energetic Camden, Kershaw County, USA, South Carolinas, our state. Our historic city in the American South lies in the upper middle of a state that edges the Atlantic Ocean on one side and the Appalachian Mountains on the opposite side. British global trade interests initiated Camden's 18th century colonial beginnings. In 1730, King George II approved a plan to attract settlers into South Carolina's interior wilderness, the backcountry. The intent was to access resources and to buffer the vital coastal port of Charleston from hostile Indian attacks. Thus, 150 miles away, a township was surveyed at the mouth of Pine Tree Creek on the navigable Wateree River. The site, however, attracted little interest. It is reasonable to wonder how such a remote area with a failed development plan came to be named Camden, especially when it is now said to be the earliest town anywhere so named. Here are a few insights. About 1750, a small colony of Quakers from Ireland settled in an area on scattered places along the Wateree River. They interacted peaceably with the native Catawba people who regularly returned for hunting and gathering. The leading Quaker, Samuel Wiley, and the king of the Catawbas, Hagler, forged a mutually protective bond important to the settlers' survival. You see King Hagler's image atop the town tower in Camden today, and he has stood over our town since the early 1800s. 8 years after the Quakers were here, in 1758, an industrious and educated 30-year-old Englishman, Joseph Kershaw, moved here to a site above Pine Tree Creek to open a trading store that would serve from the interior to the coast. Kershaw had worked in Charleston as a mercantile clerk, and with Charleston backers, the Pine Tree Hill store thrived. He too trusted King Hagler's friendship and soon married Sarah Mathis, daughter of local Quakers. With energy and connections, the Pine Tree Hill Trading Post brought together ambitious enterprises, milling, processing, and marketing local resources. While a number of productive early citizens of diverse backgrounds impacted growth here, the strong thread of Joseph Kershaw's long influence recognized him as the father of Camden. The renaming of Pine Tree Hill took place when the fast-growing backcountry was begging for local courts that could enforce law and order and for representation in helping make those laws. There was just one court in South Carolina, inconveniently in Charleston, where the colony's only popularly elected body of legislature also met. This, the Commons House of Assembly, was dominated by wealthy coastal men with little backcountry involvement. Other decisions required approval from England, so improvements came slowly. By 1767, the interior of South Carolina was widely terrorized by free-ranging outlaw bands, robberies, murders, and mayhem. In defense, desperate backcountry men banded together as regulators to enforce order and to petition grievances. Meanwhile, in Pine Tree Hill, within that Pine Tree aroused backcountry, the new name of Camden was chosen in honor of London's Charles Pratt, the first Lord Camden, then popular in America as an English champion of colonist rights for representation. The renaming was led by Joseph Kershaw, now a rising political presence. The Camden name was in use by April 12, 1768, when the Assembly approved their first act calling for local courts and decreed one to be in Camden, quote, lately called Pine Tree Hill. On July 3rd, the Reverend Charles Woodmason, Church of England minister to the backcountry, noted in his journal, quote, officiated at Pine Tree Hill, now to be called Camden in honor of Lord Camden, the Americans being very fond at present of all who declared in their favor against the Stamp Act. In 1769, the approved South Carolina Circuit Court Act established 7 district courts and courthouses. Camden was given a courthouse to serve a huge, newly defined judicial area, the Camden District. Joseph Kershaw, by then an elected member of the Assembly, would continue to be re-elected to represent the people. On the eve of the Revolutionary War, Camden had new dignity as a judicial seat. An orderly town plan showed the courthouse and a jail in use, with spaces for a market, a church, and even a fair, which in 1779 had its own traditionally English court of high powder. New houses were being built, including a hilltop manor for the Kershaw family, overlooking his store and the evolving town. In April 1775, the first blood of the American Revolution was shed in the colony of Massachusetts. In the first years of war, most of the major battles were fought in the New England and Middle colonies. In a stalemate, the British military acted to control the South, to use Southern resources to hasten an end to war. In 1780, with a 6-week concentrated siege of Charleston, the British cut off supplies by land and sent bombardments by sea to bring the burning city to unconditional surrender on May 12, 1780. The largest and wealthiest port in America, the capital government of South Carolina, was in British hands. Only days afterward, General Charles Lord Cornwallis rode inland at the head of a British force to occupy populated Camden on June 1st. Promptly, he set about establishing Camden as his main backcountry garrison and supply depot to sustain Charleston and further actions planned in the field. Work began to exert compliance and to fortify Camden with 5 redoubts and a palisade wall. The Kershaw House was commandeered as British headquarters. Camden would remain occupied and controlled for nearly a year amid persistent continental and guerrilla resistance. Today, a traveler who arrives in Camden from the south still crosses Pine Tree Creek and immediately observes on the right 2 significant interpretive facilities on grounds of original Pine Tree Hill and old occupied Camden. The first complex, the Revolutionary War Visitor Center, resembles a weathered country inn, welcoming all. Lively displays explain the Southern campaign and South Carolina's pivotal role as a revolutionary turning point. Adjoining the center, on more than 100 acres of the original town, the Revolutionary War site Historic Camden is an open-air museum of backcountry life in colonial and revolutionary days. It features 7 restored houses, fortification sites, miles of nature trails, and living history demonstrations of crafts, trades, and diverse lifestyles. Recently, the Kershaw County Historical Society, on whose behalf I am speaking, donated a restored house built by a craftsman whose labors purchased his freedom from slavery. The most dramatic reconstruction built on its excavated foundations is the Kershaw House, which became British headquarters. Besides these assets, about 8 miles distant, the Historic Camden Foundation owns over 500 acres of the site of the Battle of Camden, fought August the 16th, 1780. Here, a growing longleaf pine preserve is slowly restoring the natural appearance of the towering open forest in which 2 huge advancing armies, each unaware of the other's movements, encountered one another in the dark of night and fought a gruesome battle at dawn. The result was a high tide of British victory and a low point of rout and death for Americans. 9 months later, in a second Battle of Camden, April 25th, 1781, American forces occupied the heights of Hobkirk's Hill just above Camden and engaged the garrison's troops in battle outside the palisade. The Americans were driven off the hill, but in order, still controlling the north route. British commander, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Lord Rawdon, was victor, but 2 days earlier, his major supply line from the south had been cut. Thus, without reinforcements, he determined evacuation his only option. Burning what they could behind them, on May the 9th, the British left Camden and retreated to Charleston, accompanied by a long line of dismayed loyalists and families following with their possessions, many taking slaves with them. By the end of the Revolutionary War, well over 200 battles and skirmishes had been fought within South Carolina. Countless are our Camden-associated individual human experiences, and perspectives that reach out to us today from periods of that past. Both our Camden Archives and Museum and the Kershaw County Historical Society would appreciate hearing from persons with related information to share. We in Camden, South Carolina, thank the Camden History Society of London and Camdens Worldwide for an unparalleled opportunity of communication. Surely, Scholar William Camden would have felt honored with you carrying on his legacy. And we thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joan. I'm sorry the Mayor of Camden was unable to join us today. She had intended to welcome you all to this international event on behalf of the London Borough of Camden, the world's most populous urban Camden and the latest to be so named, only in 1965 when 3 small boroughs were merged. She was going to say that over several centuries, Camden has welcomed refugees and migrants from many countries, resulting in the ethnically diverse borough that it is today. Nowadays, it welcomes countless tourists from far and wide, visiting such world-famous attractions as the British Museum. And this evening, we welcome people in 3 continents to this event. We hope you enjoy it. Well, I certainly did. It certainly has been an international audience tonight, because apart from England, we had people from different parts of the USA, Australia, and Canada. Thank you, the 3 speakers, for such a fascinating and historic evening. And thank you also to Lindsay Douglas, our publicity and website manager, whose technical abilities has made the Zoom presentation possible. Do remember on the Camden History Society website, there will be a link to the video this evening for anyone you know who would like to watch it, who wasn't able to attend tonight. And also in the research room on the Camden History Society website is this amazing wealth of information on the Camdens throughout the world, which have been compiled by David Hayes with invaluable contributions from the other communities around the world. So thank you everyone tonight for attending, and thank you. Good night.